Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to confront the pretty radical idea. The
Mm.
idea that the literature you studied in school, the great novels, the poetry, all the works we're taught to see as high art, is fundamentally an ideology.
Right. And not just an ideology in a vague sense.
No.
It was, according to our source material, designed and institutionally implemented, not just for, aesthetic enjoyment, but for social control.
It's a huge claim. It's the story of how a specific form of writing became this state-sanctioned tool for social engineering.
And how the very definition of what counts as literary has constantly shifted to serve the needs of the ruling class at any given time.
Absolutely. When we talk about literature today, we instinctively think it means imaginative or creative writing, fiction, poems, plays.
It's our default setting.
Exactly. We treat it like this
Yeah.
eternal universal category of beautiful expression. But the source material for this deep dive delivers a pretty striking shock.
It really does.
Yeah.
It argues that this narrow modern definition of ours is historically very recent. It only really gets going around the turn of the 18th century.
So our mission today is to dismantle this myth of the timeless aesthetic.
We're going to take a deep dive into the political, the social, and the economic forces that propelled English literature from being this vague side interest into a cornerstone of national ideology.
And then eventually into the rigorously institutionalized academic discipline we know today in England.
And we're going to track three massive transformations that really define this journey.
First, the 18th century consolidation of cultural taste.
Then the romantic critique of industrial society.
And finally, the powerful, almost calculated Victorian substitution of literature for failed religion.
What's so fascinating here, and what we'll keep coming back to, is how at every single stage, the changing definition of literary served the highly specific needs of political and social authority.
Okay, let's unpack this history. Let's start in 18th century England, a period where the word literature meant something vastly different from what it means to us.
Totally different. If you ask someone like Alexander Pope or Henry Fielding what literature was, they wouldn't limit it to fiction or poetry or plays.
Not at all. In the 18th century, literature was this incredibly expansive category. It was understood as the entire body of valued writing in society.
The whole thing. So this included poetry, which was definitely highly valued, but also philosophy, history, essays, letters.
Even certain kinds of theological writing, if it was considered serious, worthwhile, and, well-written, it was literature. Period.
Which helps explain something that might seem strange to us now.
The novel.
The novel, which we now think of as, the pinnacle of English literature.
Yeah.
Back then, it was regarded with deep suspicion.
It was an upstart form, as the source calls it. Its status was frequently doubted, and the elite often didn't consider it literature at all.
And that's because the criteria for inclusion had nothing to do with whether a text was fictional or imaginative.
The criteria were explicitly ideological.
Yes, what made a text literary was whether it conformed to the standards of polite letters.
Which is a key phrase. What does that actually mean, polite letters?
It means writing that embodied the values and the refined tastes of a specific social class, the educated upper and middle classes.
So if a text embodied, say, high moral sentiments, formal order, rationality, it qualified.
Exactly. And conversely, anything from the popular sphere, things like street ballads, popular romances, anything considered coarse or unruly, was systematically excluded. It just wasn't literature.
So why? Why did they need this specific kind of broad, polite literature at this specific moment?
The answer is all about political stability. You have to remember the context. England had just emerged from the incredibly bloody civil wars of the 17th century.
Society was fragmented, deeply scarred. The ruling class desperately needed social reconciliation. They needed a common language, a new kind of social cement to hold things together.
And literature became a vital, very sophisticated instrument for entrenching and disseminating these unifying social values.
This is the era of neoclassicism, right?
Exactly. So the key ideals promoted through art and letters were things like reason, nature, order, and propriety.
And these weren't just abstract philosophical concepts.
Not at all. They were applied ideals intended to ensure predictable, harmonious social relations. A well-ordered couplet in a poem mirrored the ideal of a well-ordered society.
And this was specifically aimed at managing the rise of the commercial classes.
Yes, this is so important. The traditional aristocracy needed to incorporate the burgeoning, powerful, and I love this phrase from the source, the spiritually rather raw middle classes.
How do you unify these powerful but culturally different groups?
You do it by diffusing correct taste, common cultural standards, and refined manners. You create a shared cultural space.
And the mechanism for this is crucial. This wasn't happening in schools, not primarily.
No, it was happening through ideological institutions that shaped daily life. Things like the new periodicals, The Spectator, The Tatler,
The coffee houses.
the coffee houses, absolutely. The intellectual environment there was key, plus social treatises on manners, guides to moral behavior, even sermons.
So these coffee houses, for example, were a kind of neutral ground where a nobleman and a wealthy merchant could meet and discuss the latest essay on aesthetics or morality.
Exactly. It set a common standard of conversation and behavior. It was a form of cultural conditioning for social mobility, making sure that as new money rose, it adopted old taste.
It creates a unified ruling bloc.
And that's why our modern focus on individual expression, on a writer's unique soul, would have seemed so bizarre to them.
Right.
Literature, then, was a public governing force focused entirely on maintaining common external standards. It was emphatically not associated with felt experience, personal response, or imaginative uniqueness.
All the things we now see as the very definition of literary.
They would have seemed deeply strange, maybe even self-indulgent, to the writers of that period. The goal was to civilize society, not to express the unique, solitary self.
Okay, so that dramatic shift, the one towards prioritizing the unique solitary self, that's what really kicks off the modern sense of literature.
It does, and it begins with the Romantic period, right around the turn of the 18th into the 19th century, and it's a radical narrowing of the definition.
Suddenly, it's all about creative or imaginative work.
And this intellectual shift was not happening in a vacuum. It was driven by just monumental economic upheaval.
This is the moment England achieves its economic takeoff. It becomes the first industrial capitalist nation on Earth.
And we have to be clear about the context here. This industrial wealth was built on the back of the slave trade, on the enclosure movements that kicked peasants off their land, and on imperial expansion. It was a brutal process.
And against this backdrop, a dominant philosophy emerges for this new industrial middle class.
Utilitarianism.
And the source is very specific. It's not just practical thinking. It calls it a crassly Philistine utilitarianism.
Yeah, let's unpack Philistines there. It's not just about not liking art.
No.
A Philistine approach, in this context, is aggressively materialistic. It's being dismissive of art and culture because of a very narrow focus on practical, measurable wealth.
Utilitarianism fetishized fact. It reduced complex human relations down to market exchanges.
And it dismissed art as nothing more than unprofitable ornamentation. If it didn't produce a profit or a measurable utility, it was literally useless.
And the social costs of this were just devastating. Early industrial capitalism forced people into factory wage slavery, creating these deeply alienating labor processes.
So the Romantic move to privilege the creative imagination was not some, fluffy escapist artistic phase.
Not at all. It was a profound political and philosophical response to this materialistic and dehumanizing system.
It was an act of resistance. Literature, or imaginative writing, became one of the few places where the humane creative values being systematically crushed by industrial capitalism could still be celebrated.
We can see this so clearly in the idea of labor itself. The act of imaginative creation, writing a poem, for instance, could be held up as this potent image of non-alienated labor.
Right. It's spontaneous, it's creative, it's intrinsically valuable, which is a stark opposite of the mechanical, repetitive, profit-driven labor enforced by the factory system.
The poet becomes the very antithesis of the factory worker.
And what's more, the Romantics elevated the intuitive, the transcendental scope of the poetic mind. This provided a living criticism, as the source calls it, of those empiricist ideologies that were just enslaved to fact and sensory data.
You think of figures like Blake and Shelley here.
Absolutely. They explicitly saw the imagination as a political force. They believed its job was to transform society by restoring genuine human connection and intuition.
Blake's famous line, "If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is infinite." That's a direct shot at the reductionism of the age.
It is. But there's a downside to this elevated status.
Alienation.
Exactly. The writer, losing their traditional patrons in the aristocracy and refusing to just conform to the market, often gets pushed to the margins of society.
And this led many romantics back into the solitariness of his own creative mind.
So this powerful critique of industrial society often kind of inverts into an impotent nostalgia for a vanished, maybe mythical, pre-industrial organic England.
And this is precisely when we see the rise of modern aesthetics, the philosophy of art defined by thinkers like Kant and Hegel.
Right. Before this, art was functional. It was a history, a tribute to a patron, a prayer. Now it gets subsumed into this special, mysterious aesthetic faculty.
Why now?
Because art was now alienated from social life. If a writer couldn't get paid to write for the church or the court, they had to find a new justification for what they did.
And the new justification was, art is sacred because it's art.
Paradoxically, the advantage of creative writing became that it was gloriously useless. It was an end in itself, loftily removed from any sordid social purpose. It's pulled out of material life and raised to the status of a solitary fetish.
And this fetishizing leads us straight to the concept of the symbol.
Yes. At the very heart of Romantic aesthetic theory was what our source calls the semi-mystical doctrine of the symbol.
So why did the symbol suddenly become so important?
It emerged as a kind of panacea, a magical cure-all for the seemingly insoluble conflicts of the industrial era.
Like subject versus object, or material versus spiritual.
Order versus spontaneity.
Yeah.
The symbol was believed to magically resolve all these tensions by fusing the mind and the world. It embodied a spiritual truth that you perceived by direct intuition, not by critical analysis or, political action.
But wait a minute. Describing the symbol as a panacea for profound social conflict,
Wow.
that sounds like complete wishful thinking. It's not political reality.
Of course not.
So how did they convince anyone that literary theory could actually function as a political model?
Its utility was ideological. By presenting this symbol, this beautiful, unified artwork where every part harmoniously serves the whole as the ultimate ideal, it becomes a model for human society itself.
Ah, I see.
The political implication is crystal clear. If only the lower orders could forget their specific material grievances, little things like wages and working hours, and just pull together for the common good like the subordinate parts of a literary symbol, then all this tedious class conflict could be avoided.
It's a beautiful, transcendental justification for maintaining the status quo. And that brings us to the period that really truly sealed literature's fate as an institutional power, the late Victorian era.
And the single most important explanation for the exponential growth of English studies in this period was simply the failure of religion.
By the mid-Victorian period, the ideological bedrock of Britain was just crumbling.
You have science, specifically Darwinism, which is a massive shock to the system. You have rapid social change, the rise of industrial skepticism.
Mm-hmm.
All of this put religion, which had been the most powerful and reliable ideological tool, in deep, deep trouble.
Its unquestioned control over the hearts and minds of the masses was evaporating, and this caused immense anxiety within the establishment.
Religion was so vital because it was just so effective as a form of ideological control. It worked through images, symbols, habits, rituals, mythology.
It engages with those deep-seated, irrational fears and needs.
And it operated at every social level.
Yeah.
It was the perfect social cement, unifying the pious peasant, the wealthy merchant, and the intellectual elite in a shared framework.
And crucially, Victorian religion, particularly in its evangelical form, was a profound pacifying influence.
Oh, massively. It fostered meekness, obedience, self-sacrifice, a focus on the contemplative inner life.
All qualities highly desired by a ruling class trying to manage a newly politicized working population.
So when this whole structure begins to collapse, the need for a non-political, effective substitute, something that could carry that massive ideological burden, became absolutely paramount.
And what was found? Just sitting there ready to hand.
A remarkably similar discourse, English literature.
It had already been defined by the Romantics as dealing in intuition and feeling, and it was already separated from facts and science. It was the perfect candidate.
And the candor of the people who promoted this is just shocking. George Gordon, who was a professor of English literature at Oxford, stated it bluntly. He said, "England is sick. English literature must save it."
Wow.
He recognized that since the churches had failed, and since actual social remedies for industrial inequality were deemed too slow or too radical, English had to step in.
And the function was triple. It was to delight and instruct us, but also, and above all, to save our souls and heal the state.
That's it right there. This shows that English literature was explicitly constructed as an academic subject to fill the vacuum left by the failure of religion.
It's the same mechanism. Like religion, literature works primarily through emotion and experience.
Right. It appeals to feeling, imagination, moral sentiment, rather than the analytical thought and conceptual inquiry that was associated with scientists and philosophers who were, undermining stability.
By our time, literature has become virtually identical with the opposite of analytical thought.
Exactly. It operates in that prized territory of feeling, ready to carry that ideological task.
And if you can train the populace to look for spiritual meaning and moral solace in a poem,
Then perhaps they won't look for material meaning in, say, union organizing or political reform.
right.
The central figure in cementing this whole substitution ideology was Matthew Arnold.
Arnold was a cultural critic, a poet, but also a school inspector, which is key. He had this preternatural sensitivity to the strategic needs of the English ruling class.
His project started with the middle class, which he saw as powerful but also Philistine, incredibly narrow-minded.
He recognized this urgent need to Hellenize them. That was his term.
What did he mean by that?
To cultivate them with the best of human thought and culture, to transform them from these narrow-minded industrialists into people of sweetness and light.
So he needed to transfuse aristocratic culture into the middle classes, give them greatness and a noble spirit to underpin their economic power.
And the tool for this would be state-established schooling centered on the best culture.
But the true genius of Arnold's strategy, and this is where it becomes explicitly about social control, was its intended effect on the working class.
And he was remarkably candid about this. He said that the middle classes, with their narrow, harsh, unintelligent, and unattractive spirit, were failing. They were failing to mold or assimilate the masses below them.
And the core concern was political anarchy. The masses, he said, were eager to enter possession of the world.
So if the middle classes couldn't win their sympathy, couldn't direct them, society was perceived to be in danger of falling into anarchy.
The fear of revolution, which was ever present after the European revolutions of 1848, is the direct backdrop for this entire academic project.
And this fear led to a truly chilling articulation of literature's political role. A 20th century proponent of this movement just captured it perfectly.
I think I know the quote you mean.
He said, "Deny to working-class children any common share in the immaterial, and presently they will grow into the men who demand with menaces a communism of the material."
It's just astonishingly blunt. The implication is unmistakable. Throw the masses a few novels, and they won't throw up barricades.
Literature was chosen specifically because it was seen as an ideal distraction.
Well, it deals in universal human values, right? Love, loss, beauty, eternal truths.
Rather than what the ruling class considered inconvenient historical trivia.
Things like civil wars, the oppression of women, or the brutal dispossession of the English peasantry during the enclosures.
Exactly. Literature could place those petty demands for, say, better wages or decent housing in a grand cosmic perspective.
So this kind of education served a deep moral and social function. It rehearsed the masses in pluralistic thought. It persuaded them to acknowledge that more than one viewpoint than theirs existed, namely that of their masters.
And it's a solitary contemplative activity. It was designed explicitly to curb any disruptive tendency to collective political action.
And critically, it was cheap. It was financially efficient.
As our sources point out, English literature was the poor man's classics.
All the heroic and patriotic examples you need for citizen instruction could be impressed upon them without the cost and labor of teaching them Latin and Greek.
It was conveniently available in their own language, ready to serve the ideological task that religion had just relinquished.
The overall effect, which Arnold fully intended, was to dilute the doctrinal harsh aspects of middle-class ideology into the poetically suggestive sonorities of humane letters.
Ensuring tolerance, generosity.
And, by extension, the survival of the existing class structure and private property.
It is so deeply significant that English, as an academic subject, was first institutionalized not in the grand halls of Oxford and Cambridge, but literally in institutions that were created for the socially rising and for the lower classes.
That's absolutely correct.
Yeah.
Its origins are profoundly tied to social management. It began in places like mechanics institutes, working men's colleges, and these extension lecturing circuits that went all over the country.
And the pioneers, people like F.D. Maurice and Charles Kingsley, they focused the curriculum on cultivating larger sympathies, on promoting solidarity.
But also on instilling national pride and transmitting moral values. This preoccupation with morality has remained a key characteristic of English literary studies in the UK ever since.
Initially, though, the traditional academic elite saw it as lacking intellectual rigor.
Completely. Which then informed who they thought was appropriate to study it. There's a famous quote from a witness to a royal commission in 1877.
What did he say?
He suggested it was a suitable subject only for women and the second and third-rate men who become schoolmasters. The early proponents were constantly emphasizing the softening and humanizing effects of English.
Which fit neatly into the prevailing feminine ideological stereotypes of the time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Since English was seen as an untaxing sort of affair, dealing with feelings and sentiment rather than the virile academic disciplines like science or the professions, it was conveniently assigned to women.
Who were, of course, generally excluded from those more rigorous or career-oriented fields anyway.
But the tide turns again towards the end of the century, as British capitalism starts facing growing international competition, especially from Germany and the US.
The need for national unity and imperial confidence becomes urgent.
And so English has to acquire a masculine, imperialist aspect.
The focus shifts to consolidating a unified national identity. So English study starts emphasizing the organic national tradition, embodied by national poets like Shakespeare and Milton.
And furthermore, the inclusion of English literature in the civil service examinations allowed servants of British imperialism to display their cultural superiority to, as the source puts it, envying colonial peoples overseas.
It becomes a marker of essential British identity.
But inside the elite universities, the struggle was fierce. Oxford and Cambridge just viewed English as an upstart, amateurish affair.
They basically asked, why should we formalize the systematic study of something every cultured English gentleman already reads in his spare time?
Right. It was dismissed as idle gossip about literary taste.
The academic establishment was dominated by classics and ancient philology, and they had a very rigorous definition of what a subject was.
It had to be something that could be systematically examined, often involving rote learning, complex grammar.
And English was just too dilettante. One of the problems, which critics noted with some humor, was literally how to make English unpleasant enough to qualify as a proper academic pursuit.
This amateurism is perfectly embodied by Sir Walter Raleigh. He was the first truly literary professor at Oxford, holding his post right up to World War I.
And he was allegedly relieved when the war broke out.
Relieved, because it allowed him to abandon what he called the feminine vagaries of literature for something more manly.
War propaganda.
War propaganda. But the First World War was the decisive factor for English's final victory at Oxbridge.
The timing was perfect.
Perfect. Philology, the historical and structural study of languages, was the major academic antagonist of English studies, and it was closely bound up with Germanic influence, particularly Prussian academic rigor.
So during the war, philology gets politically smeared as a form of ponderous Teutonic nonsense.
It's basically branded as an enemy academic discipline. This clears the academic battlefield, allowing English, now reframed as the antidote to German materialism, to surge forward as a carrier of the true British national spirit.
But it wasn't just the smear campaign.
No. The deep trauma of the mass carnage of the war, the questioning of all cultural assumptions, led to a profound spiritual hungering.
In the face of the nightmare of history, as Joyce would call it, poetry seemed to provide solace, national reaffirmation.
An essential spiritual alternative to the industrial world that had delivered them into that slaughter. It's incredibly sobering to think that the institutional success of English is, in part, a legacy of that colossal, meaningless massacre.
So with English studies finally institutionalized at the heart of the establishment, the stage was set for the last great ideological transformation we're covering today.
And this was spearheaded by the scrutiny movement at Cambridge. This group took English and turned it into a full-blown moral crusade.
The architects of this new, serious academic discipline were notably different from the aristocratic dilettantes they were replacing.
Very different. Figures like F.R. Leavis, I.A. Richards, Q.D. Roth, they came primarily from the provincial petty bourgeoisie. They were the children of drapers, musical instrument dealers, works managers.
And their nonconformist, often lower middle-class backgrounds gave them the necessary distance to challenge the literary judgments and social assumptions of the previous upper-class generation.
A generation they felt was culturally bankrupt and had led Britain to ruin in the Great War.
So by the early 1930s, English was being viewed by these scrutineers not just as a subject, but as the supremely civilizing pursuit. It was the repository of the spiritual essence of the social formation.
The journal Scrutiny, which they launched in 1932, stressed the absolute moral centrality of English studies and its crucial relevance to the quality of social life as a whole.
They framed their entire work as a moral and cultural crusade against what they called mass society.
And the enemy was very clear to them. It was the mechanized, commercialized society that produced trashy romances, alienated labor, banal advertisements, and vulgarizing mass media.
They were trying to cultivate complex, discriminating, morally serious responses in their students to help them survive this cultural wasteland.
But since the scrutineers refused to engage with political or economic analysis, they hated industrial capitalism, but they offered no socialist alternative.
They offered a historical alternative instead.
Right. They looked back nostalgically to the organic community of 17th century agrarian England.
Which was a convenient and, as the source argues, probably mythical benchmark for judging modern industrial life.
And this idealization led to the Levesian concept of essential Englishness. This was a conviction that some forms of the English language were inherently superior because they were healthy.
Healthy language, what does that mean?
They believed language was only healthy when it concretely enacted felt experience, when the words on the page felt like they were rooted in real sensuous life, thus manifesting the true essence of Englishness.
So they championed dramatically concrete writers like John Donne or Gerard Manley Hopkins.
Exactly. Writers whose language they felt was rooted in the body and the senses. Conversely, they rejected what they called Latinate or verbally disembodied writers, like Milton and Shelley,
who they accused of using language abstractly, divorced from real experience.
For them, reading healthy language was literally a way to regain vital touch with the roots of one's own being, which they believed modern life had stripped away.
Now, while Leavis was leading this charge at Cambridge, the wider critical landscape was really dominated by T.S. Eliot.
Oh, he cast a massive ideological shadow, and he influenced the scrutineers profoundly, even when they disagreed with him.
Eliot represented a very distinct political tradition. He rejected middle-class liberalism and advocated for a deeply conservative, even authoritarian social and political order.
And in literature, this manifested as his concept of the tradition with a capital T, an impersonal selective order that determines which works are valuable and which are just discarded.
Eliot's poetry itself, something like The Waste Land from 1922, is a fascinating contradiction.
It is. He deployed the most modernist, avant-garde techniques, fragmentation, multiple voices, complex mythology.
But for profoundly conservative, or as the source says, arrière-garde ends.
Yes, arrière-garde looking backward. He was using modern techniques to enforce a return to a pre-liberal, hierarchical, social, and cultural structure.
He was explicitly seeking a common identity through mythology and archetypes to resolve the crisis of European society.
And to bypass what he saw as the failed, exhausted project of liberal rationalism, especially after the trauma of the war.
So, returning to Leavis, his academic legacy is tied to two key critical methods: practical criticism and close reading.
Right. Practical criticism was designed to scorn what he called belletristic waffle, vague impressionistic chat about books.
And it insisted on judging greatness by focusing solely on the text, completely isolated from its cultural and historical context.
And the philosophical argument underpinning this was that if literature truly reflects healthy human experience, then judging it must be intuitive. It's like a doctor judging a pulse beat. You don't need historical data. You can feel the text's vitality immediately.
And this emphasis led directly to close reading, which, while it's valuable for stopping vague generalizations,
it implied that attention must be paid only to the words on the page, rather than the economic, social, or political context that produced them.
This is where we need to introduce the concept of reification. This is crucial.
It is. The close reading method encouraged the reification of the literary work. Reification is the act of treating an abstract concept, or in this case, a piece of art, as if it were a physical, isolated object.
Divorced from the human hands, the social struggles, the historical dynamics that actually produced it.
So, by focusing so obsessively on the isolated text, they divorced the literature from its own ideological origins, the very origins we've been tracking today, and they made it seem like a purely spiritual, timeless object. This tendency was later perfected by the American New Criticism movement.
Despite its moral zeal, the scrutiny movement's core case was just inescapably elitist.
Oh, completely. They judged the overwhelming majority of society, the masses who preferred popular novels and magazines, as morally callous, humanly banal, and imaginatively bankrupt.
And the ultimate, most persuasive justification for this rigorous, morally serious study of literature was simple and very appealing.
It made you a better person.
That's it. Reading great literature cultivated moral seriousness and complexity, and that supposedly equipped you to navigate a corrupt modern world without succumbing to materialism.
And yet, our source material delivers a punch-to-the-gut anecdote that just exposes the fatal flaw in this entire assumption.
When Allied troops were arresting concentration camp commandants at the end of World War II, they discovered that these men had spent their leisure time reading Goethe.
Reading one of the great pillars of German high culture.
That one anecdote is just devastating proof that reading great literature does not guarantee morality in the simple, direct way the Levizites had predicated their entire academic discipline upon.
It shatters the belief that aesthetic sensibility automatically translates into political humanity.
And unable to reconcile their profound humanism with the political realities of industrial capitalism, which they hated but refused to analyze politically, their initial radicalism just collapsed.
It did. The humanism of the later Levis was pushed toward the most banal political reaction. He started expressing hostility to popular education, opposing modern technology, and lamenting the passing of the English gentleman.
The wheel of ideology had come full circle, right back toward deference and nostalgia. What a journey. I mean, if you step back and look at the entire trajectory of what English literature has meant, it's impossible to conclude that this discipline just emerged from a purely spontaneous desire for beauty or truth.
Not at all. It began as 18th century social governance, this expansive, polite letters designed to spread shared standards of taste and integrate the rising middle class into a stable ruling coalition.
It was profoundly ideological, serving reconciliation after the chaos of the Civil War.
Then came the Romantic protest. That radically narrowed the definition to the imaginative as a necessary, spontaneous criticism of the crass, utilitarian values of early industrial capitalism.
But even that critique quickly became isolated, turning art into a reified fetish and the symbol into a political model for unquestioning social unity.
And finally, in the Victorian crisis of faith, English literature was consciously and strategically adopted as the ideological successor to failed religion.
It provided the essential, effective, and emotional social cement necessary to maintain order, specifically by distracting the working class from material demands by promoting high-minded contemplation and deference.
And the ultimate professionalization, led by the scrutiny movement, turned it into a deeply serious moral crusade against the perceived vulgarity of mass society. But it was a crusade that was ultimately crippled by its refusal to engage with the political and economic systems it diagnosed as diseased.
The key takeaway for you, the listener, is just monumental. The knowledge we acquire about what is great or tasteless or aesthetic is never neutral.
Never. Every curriculum, every required reading list, every judgment of a work's timeless quality is deeply rooted in centuries of institutional struggle for social and political authority. We are, in a sense, studying the fossilized remnants of an ideological conflict.
So, if the study of English was originally designed, and this is in the words of Arnold and his Victorian proponents, to curb collective political action, to promote meekness, foster deference, and maintain the class structure by offering immaterial fulfillment instead of material change, we have to ask a final question.
What ideological functions does our appreciation of literature serve in the world today? Are we still seeking a purely aesthetic solace from the nightmare of history? Or are we using literature as the political weapon the Romantics originally intended it to be? A tool to truly interrogate the power structures that determine who gets to read and what they read in the first place.